Welcome back, everyone. Today we are going to be discussing the parting of the ways, which is actually not something that I've invented, but it's actually a phrase used by historians and theologians to refer to the splitting of Christianity and Judaism. And so that is what we are going to be discussing today, is how these two religions, which we know were originally one, how they split, when they split, why they split, who split them. We're giving names and calling out people and something like that. Anyways, so we actually have too many sources to put on our introduction slide today. As you can see, here are all of our sources today. It looks like we have almost, 10 of them. But yeah, here are our sources, and something that I've tried to do for this presentation and potentially presentations going forward is not only giving the book titles, but also the page numbers so that if any of you have these books or would like to buy them in the future, you can go back to these pages that I'm referencing and you can say, oh, John was telling the truth. He was actually drawing this information from these specific pages. And so here they are, and we can just jump into our outline. Here's our outline for the presentation today. We're first going to be discussing the destruction of the Holy Temple by the Roman army in 70 CE. We'll also be discussing the exclusion of the Jewish Nazarenes. Why I say Jewish Nazarenes is because, the Nazarenes were all Jews. And it's to help us distinguish them from the Gentile Christians, which during the first century they were all united under one authority structure or umbrella, so to speak. They were all being led by James and James's shluchim, his the people that he sends out to do his bidding, basically. Like Paul and Peter and Barnabas and the rest of these disciples. They go out and they are instituting certain things among the congregations, such as teaching the Gentiles the Noahide clause and putting into place the ruling that James had instituted in Acts 15. And so, secondly, we are going to be talking about, I'm sorry, not secondly, thirdly, we will be talking about Bar Kokhba, who is more popularly, although errantly, called Bar Kokhba. We will be talking about Bar Kokhba, who was rejected as the Messiah by the Nazarenes. Because, of course, the Nazarenes are following the Nazarene Messiah, Yeshua, and Bar Kokhba has no role for them. He's a military man, and really nothing more. He's a political figure, a military person. There's also the anti-Semitism of the early church fathers, which this I think is where we will be looking at this, exposing ourselves to this for the first time, I believe. And we'll be looking at some of the early anti-Semitic statements of some of the early theologians and early writers of the church. And unfortunately, I could go, a whole other hour or 2 hours on this topic alone. But we'll only be covering, I think, 2 or 3 examples just to give you kind of a taste of some of the sentiment that was going on and some of the beliefs that were being believed. And after that, we'll be discussing changing demographics, which, if you don't know what demographics means, that's referring to, for example, politicians. They want to appeal to certain racial demographics, only white people or black people or Middle Eastern people or East Asian people or Hispanics or American Indians, for example. Or religious demographics. You have different religions. And so when we're talking about a change in demographics, it's a change in the composition of Judaism, basically. And once we get to that slide, I think it'll make more sense. I know I'm not explaining it too well right now, but hopefully I can at that time. Also, we'll be looking at some Roman policies toward Gentile Christians. We've already kind of discussed this, but we'll be looking at it in more depth. And hopefully this will kind of help us to see with all of these things happening all around the same few decades. This is just a crap maelstrom, tornado, or whirlpool. It just so many things are happening all at once. It's, as we say nowadays, the perfect storm of, half a dozen negative things influencing both developing religions that cause them to just bend, crack, and then totally split. And so, moving into the actual lecture for today, in terms of the destruction of the temple, we know that the temple was destroyed by the Romans in 70 CE, and this is commemorated by the fast day, not the day that goes by really fast. In fact, it probably goes by pretty slowly. For most people, is Tisha B'Av, which is the 9th of Av. The Av is a Jewish month on the calendar, and so on this day, the 9th of Av, it commemorates the destruction of the temple because it's taught that the temple was destroyed on that day. And so we fast on that day in commemoration and mourning for the destruction. This, in turn, the destruction of the temple, actually did away with the Sadducees because, as we remember from previous lectures, and maybe you just know this on your own, but the Sadducees were, they had an umbilical cord tied to the temple. They couldn't exist without the temple. That's like if America went under and we all descended into anarchy, the government was abolished, Republican Democratic parties wouldn't exist, right? They're part of the American political system. You do away with America, you do away with the parties. When you do away with the Holy Temple, you do away with the Sadducees because that's where their base of power was. And while they didn't control how things operated within the temple, Josephus says that they actually submitted to the Pharisees in terms of temple practices. Any power that they did have was based in the temple. And so, for example, in the Gospels, we see that the high priest has guards, and he's able to arrest Yeshua and some of his disciples, not all in the same instance, but at the end of the Gospels and then early on in Acts. He uses his temple guards to arrest people, and so it's just one example of the power of the high priesthood, which had been corrupted at this time. Because of its Hellenization and its connections with the Romans. So when the temple was destroyed, there was nothing to base their power around. They lost their headquarters. They were dispersed, and many of them had been killed by the Romans. So it's not that they couldn't pick up the pieces, there's just no pieces to pick up. There's also the Pharisees and Nazarenes contingency planning. Which, what I mean by that is that the Pharisees had already personalized many of the temple practices. So, for example, it is a biblical commandment for the priests to immerse in water. And so the Pharisees and the Nazarenes, inspired by the Pharisees, no doubt, and possibly the Essenes, they took this practice of immersion and said, we're going to do this in our own lives because it's a holy practice, it's a good practice, it's a righteous and pious practice. There's no prohibition of us doing it, so let's do it. And this is where the institution of baptism comes from. It's from the priests immersing for the sake of working in the temple. And the same with the washing of hands. The priests were the one who would wash their hands, but the Pharisees took this on themselves and said, this is a great idea because the judges have authority to determine how Torah is done. They don't have authority to add or subtract to the Torah, but they can determine how Torah is done with the commandments that God already gave. And so they said, well, we have kosher laws. We are going to say that because we want to be a holy nation, a nation of priests and kings, we are going to spiritualize and personalize these temple practices. And so before we eat bread, at least, and really before any meal, nowadays Jews wash their hands. Unless they can eat it right out of the wrapper, maybe. But like a snack bar or something. they washed their hands. Why? Because the priests did, and the priests are holy. That's something that helps them to be holy. And so the Pharisees said, we want to be holy people, and we're going to do this. It's a good thing anyways, so we're going to do that. The Nazarenes also did this, but not to as much of a degree, in addition or beyond the Pharisees. In fact, later on, in the centuries after the destruction of the temple, some, although not all, of the Nazarenes concluded that Yeshua's death was a termination of sacrifices. And some of the Nazarenes in later centuries, like hundreds of years later, whether it's 100 or 300 or 400, it's as we'll see in next week's lesson, there was a lot of diversity and a lot of fracturing and just a lot of confusion. So I'm trying to keep this simple for right now. But some of the Nazarenes became vegans. They did not believe in slaughtering animals. And they said, well, the temple system, I guess, is just gone for good. And while that is a mistaken belief, again, not all of them believed this, just some of them did, this is just something that happened. And so what they did is that the Nazarenes, in a certain sense, copied the Pharisees, or were inspired by the Pharisees, however you'd like to look at that. And they were spiritualizing aspects of the temple services into their lives. So, for example, Paul says that the body of believers is the temple. He says that, I'm sorry, not he says, in, I believe, Psalms, it says that we are to offer the offerings of our lips and so forth. And so these things were spiritualized and given metaphorical meaning rather than physical applications. But the same kind of idea, was being done by both Pharisees and Nazarenes. There's also the attention shifts from the temple institution, or the temple as an institution, to the institution of synagogues, which you have you have sacrifices going on in the temple, you have prayer services, you have singing, you have, that's the place where all the people go, by the command of God, for the holidays. You all go up to the temple 3 times a year for 3 of the holidays at least. And so with the destruction of the temple, we find that people are just going to their local synagogues because that's just the next best thing. That's the next best alternative to going to the temple because the temple is destroyed. And so we find that synagogues become the focal point of Jewish and Noahide communities because we know that Gentile Noahides were fellowshipping with Jews. We see this evidenced in Acts. We also see evidence for this in the Talmud and other rabbinic literature. And so the Jew and Gentiles are actually, they're making synagogues kind of the focus of their religious communities. And they become community centers, basically, where that's where you go for a big life event, that's where you go for holidays, that's where you go to pray on a daily basis. That's even where you would go for signing contracts. That's where you would go for to seek advice from the rabbi on legal decisions. It had a multifunctional purpose. Also, with spiritualized and personalized temple practices, synagogues became like replacement temples. And so, like I said, the prayers in the synagogue were likened to the offerings in the temple. The washing of hands was like the washing of hands by priests in the temple. The talit that you would wear while you pray is reminiscent of the tabernacle in the wilderness. And so we find that there's this imagery that is being taken up during this time. Now, the talit wasn't invented at this time. It existed earlier, but as things progress in history, they take on new meaning, additional meaning, and they're understood differently given the circumstances that people find themselves in. And so, moving on to the exclusion of the Jewish Nazarenes from synagogue life, we find that Yeshua actually prophesies this when he says that the Nazarenes are going to be thrown out of the synagogues. Which, what's interesting, the word synagogue is actually just means congregation, and so does the word ecclesia, which is normally translated as church, but it means congregation. Both of them mean congregation. But and what's funny is that I think in the book of James, James says, when you go to the synagogue, but modern Christian translations will say, oh, that's actually church. He means church. It's like, well, that's not what he says. But that maybe that's a discussion for another day. But anyways, Yeshua says that you will be thrown out of your synagogue, your congregation, your synagogue. And this is what we find happening. We find that in the 2nd century, we find Rabbi Shmuel Hakatan. Hakatan in Hebrew just means the little or the small, or I guess in a certain sense you could understand it as being junior. So Rabbi Samuel Jr. Was asked by Rabban Gamliel II. So this is actually a descendant of the Gamliel that we know, that appears in the book of Acts. Not the same guy, I think it's his grandson, if I'm not mistaken. And it's Gamaliel's grandson, or whoever he is, Rabban Gamliel II, that asks Shmuel Hakatan to make a bracha, a blessing, for these heretics, these minim. And so it's called the Birkas HaManim, the blessing for the heretics. And of course, when you're praying, when you're praying the Shmoneh Esrei, the daily prayer that has 18 benedictions, you can't add a curse to your list of benedictions, and so you call it a blessing when it's actually a curse. And so here is the text of the Birkas HaManim. For the apostates, let there be no hope, and let the arrogant government, referring to Rome, be speedily uprooted in our days. Let the minim, the heretics, be destroyed in a moment, and let them be blotted out of the book of life and not be inscribed together with the righteous. Blessed art thou, O Lord, who humbles the arrogant. Now, from a biblical perspective, this is not actually the worst thing in the world, because similar things are said about pagans and the Gentile nations that are oppressing Israel, and so it's actually not as terrible as it might sound. Although, in reality, you're still cursing people, and James, Yaakov HaTzadik, says, we curse people, we curse human beings that are made in the image of God, yet we bless God. This, we have salt water and fresh water coming from the same spring. This should not be. And so, he's probably not referring to this, the Birkas HaManim, because it wasn't written yet. But it's believed by some scholars that a version of it existed from Maccabean times, and Shmuel Hakatan, at the instigation of Rabban Gamliel II, actually just changed the previously existing bracha to include the Nazarenes. And so, in fact, in one version of the Birkas HaManim that I encountered, it included the words, let the Nazarenes, let the Nosrim, and the Minim, the heretics, be destroyed in a moment. And so in that version of it, we're not exactly sure which is the original, and there's good reasons why really nobody knows. But we don't really know which one was the one that Shmuel Hakatan actually devised or edited. And so, interestingly enough, this is actually, when it speaks of the Minim, there is tons of scholarly debate on this. Who are they? Who could they possibly be? And it has been suggested anywhere from being the Sadducees to the Samaritans to the Hellenists and the Herodians, or the Nazarenes, which many people believe is a possibility, and I think that there is some argument to be made with that. But it also could include ethnically Jewish Gentile Gnostics. It could include many different people. It could include even multiple groups. These are all analyses that scholars have looked at the text. They said, who is this referring to? Because we don't actually know. Because minim, heretics, can refer to almost anyone. And so, is it referring to the Nazarenes? Possibly. Is it referring to the Sadducees? Possibly. We don't really know. And so, when we're trying to figure out how the Nazarenes were kicked out of the synagogues, this is a strong possibility, but we don't know for sure. This is a theory. I think possibly a good theory, but it's a theory nonetheless. And so, basically, what would happen is that if you were a min, or from the minim, if you were a heretic from among the heretics, then you could not pray in the synagogue because you would be cursing yourself. So that's how you kick people out, is that you make them curse themselves. But the problem with this is that if you don't consider yourself a heretic, then you're like, oh, I have no problem with this. I'm not a heretic. I'm not a min. So it's a very complicated thing, but I thought that I'd bring it up just to expose you guys to this and basically just inform you it exists. There's debate on it. We don't know a whole lot in terms of who it applies to. But if it is referring to the Nazarenes, hypothetically, it would be contrary to what Rabban Gamliel II's ancestor, Rabban Gamliel I, said, because Rabban Gamliel I supported the Nazarenes and defended them in the book of Acts. So is he going against his grandfather's wishes? It's possible, if it's referring to the Nazarenes. So I'll leave it at that. So again, why... We know that the Nazarenes were kicked out of the synagogues eventually, right? Christians don't still go to synagogue. That's kind of a given, obvious fact. But why was this so bad, right? Yeshua says it like it's the end of the world, like there's going to be signs in heaven, there's going to be earthquakes, there's going to be wars and rumors of wars, you're going to get kicked out of the synagogues, Antichrist is coming, why is it grouped in with all of these other things? Why is this so bad? Couldn't they have just fellowshipped with other Nazarenes? Yeah, they could have. And eventually, that is actually what happens, is that when they are kicked out of the synagogues, they do form their own congregations. Or they try to they all move as a community to another community, and they try to join the synagogues there. And sometimes they're accepted, sometimes they're not. It's really just hit and miss. You never really know how it's going to turn out. And so some congregations were much stricter than others, and some congregations were very adamant, no, we don't want any Nazarenes here. And some congregations were like, if you're not causing us trouble, sure, come on in. It was very diverse. And so, but again, why was this bad? Why this is bad is because the foundation of Judaism, first of all, is God and Torah. The second is community. That a number of places in the Torah says that punishment for a certain sin is not that you go to hell, it's not that you get the death penalty, it's not that you're stoned. You don't have to pay a certain fine, but you're excluded from the community. And the same thing actually happens with certain kinds of uncleanness, like if you have zaros, or it's commonly called leprosy, but it's not actually leprosy. If you have zaros, then you can be excluded from the community and made to live outside. You are excluded. And that was basically the social death penalty. And so while you didn't physically die, although I suppose it's certainly possible that you die out on your own, you would be excluded from all your family and friends and the rest of the world. You couldn't go observe the holidays. You couldn't have any fellowship with anyone unless they went out to you. And sometimes this did happen. It's not like families were totally insensitive to people. They still loved their families. But it made it harder, and over time you might accidentally forget about them. You might, oh yeah, they're out there. I should go and see them sometime. And never go do it. Because they get busy, they forget, whatever. But there was some interaction, but it was very minimal. And so this is kind of like what we experience with the Nazarenes, is that it's this social ostracization. Is that a real word? Well, it is now. I'm making it up. This ostracizing of the Nazarenes from communal synagogal life is just, it's a very hurtful thing. Something that I don't think that modern Christians really have anything to compare to. Because if you don't like this church, you don't like this, let's just say Baptist church, you go to the Presbyterian church. You don't like that one, go to the Methodist church. You don't like that one, go to the Lutheran church, whatever. You didn't do that in ancient times. The synagogue was your family, almost. And so, them shaming you or excluding you or not accepting you, it's like, what do you mean? I thought we were all in this together. We're all Jews here. We're the children of God. How can you do this to me? We've grown up together. We've been to each other's potlucks. We've babysitted each other's kids. I see you every single day, and we pray together. We're praying to the same God, and you want to exclude me? What's the deal? Why are you doing this? So that's kind of this mindset that we're talking about, and that's one reason why it was a terrible thing to be excluded from the synagogues. Now, what's funny is that, as far as I know, they were never actually excommunicated. They just weren't allowed to come in. But we will see a certain excommunication, which in Judaism is very, very, very rare. And difficult too. But we do find one ancient example from, I believe, the early 2nd century. So about 100 years after Yeshua's time. But first, we'll be looking at exclusion of the Jewish Nazarenes from Jewish life and authority. So, like I said, they were excluded from Jewish communal life and social life. They were also excluded from levels of authority or roles of authority. And so, if there was a Nazarene rabbi, they would not have been allowed as part of a Beis Din, a court, a Torah court, and they would not have been able to establish their own academies, not because they weren't allowed to, but because you need students, you need followers in your academies. You need funding somehow, right? Same thing with private schools. You need to fund them. You need rich people to go to your schools. And so, when when your community are called Ibionim, the poor ones, you can't really fund an academy. And so, who else do you have to go to when the rest of Judaism rejects you? Right? So there was a kind of a de facto exclusion rather than a, I forget exactly what the term would be, is it de juris exclusion or something like that, but it's basically legal exclusion versus social exclusion, where they weren't legally excluded, they just weren't socially. So, or they were socially excluded. Anyways, so we find Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, who reestablishes the Sanhedrin at Yavne, which is near Jerusalem. So basically, the Sanhedrin met in the, not to get us confused here, but the upper room of the temple, in the Chamber of Hewn Stone. And so when the Romans tore down and burned to a crisp the Holy Temple, the Sanhedrin had nowhere to go. They lost their headquarters, just like the Sadducees lost their headquarters. And so the sages relocated to Yavne, which is in English sometimes called Jamnia for some reason. But they go to this place called Yavne, and they reestablish the Sanhedrin there. And it is at this place that it's believed where we find the final canonization of the Tanakh, which is, of course, the Torah, the Nevi'im, the prophets, the Ketuvim, the writings. And it is here that the Torah is already accepted, the prophets are already accepted, the Ketuvim are mostly accepted. They're trying to sort out like 2 books. And so these are debated at Yavne, and the rabbis decide, yes, we've used them the whole time, they are actually kosher books. Let's just include them as being part of the Ketuvim. And so that's the Ketuvim part of the Tanakh is canonized. And that is in around the, I think, 90 CE, if I remember correctly. Maybe 80 or 90 CE. And after this time, because of problems with the Romans, they eventually start moving to all these different cities, 2 or 3 different places, I believe. And we find that during this process of the exiled Sanhedrin, I guess you could say, the rabbis start establishing, they go out into Judea, and they're starting their own academies, whereby they have courts, Batei Din, and schools, or yeshivot. You have Torah schools, where Torah legal cases can be decided, and also where students can go to learn the Torah from these big-name rabbis. And so these are established all throughout Judea. Now, what's interesting is that we find Rabbi Eliezer, who is actually from the school of Shammai. At this time, you had not Hillel and Shammai, but you had Rabbi Joshua and Rabbi Eliezer. And these are kind of the 2 big names from the houses of Hillel and Shammai. And so we find this episode in the Talmud where the Talmud records that Rabbi Eliezer, he is having a conversation with a Nazarene, a follower of Yeshua. And what's really interesting is that this is rabbinic literature. This is not the Gospels. This is not the Book of Acts. This is the rabbis themselves saying that one of the sages was having a Torah discussion with one of the Nazarenes, and Rabbi Eliezer asks this Nazarene, what are your thoughts on this certain issue? The Nazarene gives him his halakhic opinion, and Rabbi Eliezer says, I'll think on that. That sounds good. And we find this out because Rabbi Eliezer is actually brought to court, and he's charged with basically just being a Torah criminal. It's kind of hard to explain, but it's basically he's accused of breaking Torah. And the reason that the court gives is that he learned Torah from these Nazarenes. And Rabbi Eliezer says, I plead guilty. I did have that conversation. And according to you, I have transgressed this verse and this verse and this verse. And so, or maybe he actually thought that he did transgress these verses. Who knows? But all we do know is that he did have a conversation from the Nazarene, and he learned a Torah insight from him. And this Nazarene might have learned it from the apostles, or he might have learned it from, this is probably too late for learning it directly from Yeshua, but this might have been a teaching directly from Yeshua that was passed down, or something that the Nazarenes had concluded on their own. And so how this episode ends is that Rabbi Eliezer is actually excommunicated. And this is a very rare time in Jewish history. And I don't even know if it happened before then. It might have. Maybe during the Maccabean period or something. But, we find that one of the Jewish sages from the house of Shammai, which is interesting because Shammai is usually the opposite of Yeshua, but we find in this case that he liked the ruling, apparently. He's excommunicated because of his association with Nazarene legal opinions. And which I find that fascinating. And so if Rabbi Eliezer is excommunicated because he's talking to a Nazarene about Torah, then certainly the Nazarenes teaching Torah was out of the question, right? It's just kind of basic, rational conclusion to come to. There was also Roman threats that began increasing, and so the sages flee to Galilee. Yep. The Sanhedrin is reestablished in Galilee. The sages use, and when we're referring to the sages, we're referring to the authoritative rabbis who gave authoritative legal opinions as part of the oral law. And so the sages actually use this city called Sepphoris, which is in Galilee. And wouldn't you have it, Sepphoris is only a few miles away from Nazareth. Now, why did they choose this as their base? Because I believe it was Yochanan ben Zakkai that made the decision. But whoever it was, they believed that Sepphoris, being this huge Hellenistic city, basically the Roman capital of Galilee, the Jews didn't care about it. That was a Roman city, but the Romans did. It was basically the administrative center of Galilee. It was a Hellenistic city, and they wanted to help the Jews that were there come back to Torah and to leave the Roman Hellenistic ways behind. And so it was almost like a evangelistic effort to get Jews back to Judaism. And what's funny, what I personally find funny is that they are in Yeshua's backyard. They relocated to his hometown almost. And it's my personal belief that Yeshua worked in Sepphoris as some kind of carpenter or mason, basically a tradesman, because there would have been a lot of job opportunities there, and Nazareth would not have had many jobs because there was maybe 200 people there, 100 people there. It's basically a neighborhood. That's what ancient Jewish villages were. It's just basically a neighborhood. And so Yeshua probably would have walked into town early in the day, did his work, and come back at night. Now, nothing in the Gospels specifically says this. In fact, Sepphoris isn't even mentioned, but we know that it was just a few miles away. Now, unfortunately, I think that it kind of shows that the sages did not want the Nazarenes interfering with or being included with or participating in legal matters, because although they basically set up headquarters in Yeshua's backyard, or the backyard of his hometown, Nazareth, no Nazarenes that we know of were invited to be part of it, or maybe there were just not any big-name Nazarene rabbis that the sages respected. Who knows? So we do find that. Also, just kind of repeating things, the Nazarenes are excluded from synagogue life and undoubtedly academic and leadership spheres too. And I say this in part because there's no record of them, that I know of at least, of them teaching in the academies, of teaching in the Sanhedrin. Although we do find Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, they are all dead by this point. They're very, very dead at this point, because it's been about 100 years after that time, and they would have been probably middle-aged to older men during the time of Yeshua and the apostles. And so, with people like these great holy men having passed, who took up their mantle? Are there maybe secret Nazarenes that had infiltrated the ranks of the sages and influenced some of the things that they taught? It's certainly possible. I don't think it's very probable, but it is possible. And so, ultimately, we have no idea what they did. And it's not terribly important, because we know that there was generally anti-Nazarene sentiment among the rabbis of this time. And part of that we'll be getting into this week and then also next week as well. So, moving on, in terms of Bar Kokhba, who is the false messiah of the 2nd century, of the 130s CE, we know that Yeshua actually prophesied of false Meshichim meaning messiahs, plural. Mashiach is the singular. In Matthew 24, he says, "Many will come in my name." What is Yeshua's name or reputation? It's the Messiah. This is the name above all names that was given to him. God appointed him to be the Messiah. God says, "I choose you, Yeshua, to be the Messiah." And so he receives his Meshichut, his Messiahship, I guess you could call it. And so we find that these Meshichim, these false Meshichim, they come in his name, trying to take his name on themselves, not saying, "I'm Jesus," but saying, "I'm the Messiah." Does that make sense? They're not going around saying, "Hey everyone, I'm Jesus and I'm back." They're saying, instead, "I'm the true Messiah." Do we get that? And Bar Kokhba was one of these people who claimed, "I'm the true Messiah." And I'm sure that he probably had decent intentions saying that. I'm sure that he probably was not really familiar with Yeshua. But he was mistaken in thinking that he was the Messiah. And although certain rabbis at the time believed that he was, because he was acting like the Messiah, that cannot be denied. He was fulfilling certain messianic prophecies, but he didn't fulfill them all. And so, I mean, the Messiah is supposed to be a warlord that regathers Israel, the tribes of Israel, that fights the enemies of Israel and rebuilds the temple. And Bar Kokhba did fight the enemies of Israel, but he died. And he didn't regather the tribes of Israel, he didn't rebuild the temple. And so, in addition to a number of other things, he just simply was not the Messiah. And this is why the Nazarenes didn't accept him, also because they already knew who the Messiah was. And they knew that Yeshua was the one who was going to be the Messiah, and not Bar Kokhba. Now, certain rabbis that believed that he was, these Tannaitic sages, the Tannaim, were the rabbis between 100 BC, 200 AD. These Tannaitic sages, such as Rabbi Akiva and some others, believed that Bar Kokhba was the Messiah, and Rabbi Akiva gave him this nickname called Bar Kokhba, which means son of the star. Now, what is this referring to? Is it referring to Lucifer, son of the morning, the bright star? No, it is not, because it's not actually talking about the devil anyways. But it is referring to Numbers 24:14, which says, "A star shall go forth from Jacob," and this is a messianic prophecy, right? Even Christians believe this is a messianic prophecy, but they say this is the star over Bethlehem. Rabbi Akiva was saying that Bar Kokhba was Bar Kokhba. Is that making sense? Bar Kokhba is this guy who's fighting the Romans, and Rabbi Akiva says, "You are Bar Kokhba. You are the Messiah." Now, Bar Kokhba is actually just the name that he invented. But calling him the son of the star is calling him the Messiah. It's the same thing. And so when the Nazarenes refused to support Bar Kokhba, which is his actual name, although historians usually refer to him as Bar Kokhba, obviously the Nazarenes don't call him Bar Kokhba because they don't consider him the star rising out of Judah, thus they don't consider him to be Mashiach. And so when the Nazarenes refused to support Bar Kokhba, this angered a lot of people, because Bar Kokhba was seen as this guy who was going to liberate Israel, rebuild the temple, bring national salvation in a physical sense, not some kind of heavenly sense. He was going to deliver Israel from the Roman power, and things were going to be great. This was basically King David 2.0. Right? King David fought the enemies of Israel. He and his son built the temple. David did by designing the temple. And so people had a lot of hope in Bar Kokhba, and the Nazarenes were like, "No, we're not buying it." And this angered a lot of people. But then when Bar Kokhba died, Rabbi Akiva and the other ones had to apologize and say, "Well, maybe we were wrong. He wasn't actually Bar Kokhba at all. He was just simply Bar Kokhba, which was his actual name." And so, because Bar Kokhba was not accepted as the true Messiah, people were mad at the Nazarenes. And because they did not support Bar Kokhba's efforts to fight the Romans, they were mad at the Nazarenes. But even after Bar Kokhba had died, which, by the way, Bar is not a first name, it means son of. I don't know if he had a first name. He just normally called Bar Kokhba, the son of Kokhba. But even after he died, even in the decades after, people were still mad at the Nazarenes. They're like, we remember that you did not help us fight the Romans. They forget that this was a false Messiah, by the way. Of course, modern Jews recognized that he was a false Messiah. But at the time, people apparently had forgotten or ignored the fact that he was a false Messiah. And they said, we remember that you didn't help us fight the Romans. You're basically traitors. The Nazarenes are like, what did we do? We don't support this guy's messianic efforts because we don't believe that he's the Messiah. It's not the end of the world here. The war is over. We're all in this together. We're all in exile together now. Let's just get over it. And the mainstream Judaism had a difficult time doing that, or the mainstream Jewish population, I should say. There's also the change in demographics, and so here's the slide that I was talking about. It'd be a little easier to explain once we get to it. We find that there is increased Hellenization or Gentilization of quote-unquote Christianity. Now, when I say Christianity, I'm usually referring to the Gentile sect or the Gentile side, the Gentile movement of Jesus believers. Now, in this sense, I mean all of Jesus believers, where we find more Gentiles coming in, and they start, by the end of the first century, beginning of the second century, they are making up the vast majority of believers. I don't know if it's maybe 80 or 90%, but it's very high. There's also the growing Gentile resentment toward and condemnation of Jews and Judaism. And so Gentile believers are increasingly blaming the Jews for killing Christ, even though it was actually the Romans. And even though it was actually the Sadducees that turned him in and was responsible for the kidnapping. But they didn't exist anymore, so the closest thing that Gentiles could point to were the Pharisees, were the sages. And so these early Christians started blaming the rabbis, saying, you guys personally are somehow at fault. And in later Christian writings, this concept is developed and elaborated on into the perpetual guilt of the entire Jewish people. And we're not going to get into why that's the case. I think it's petty and inaccurate, and it's not terribly important for our purposes today even. But we do see this growing resentment and condemnation toward the Jewish people and the Jewish religion, which eventually what this turns into is just outright anti-Semitism. It is Jew hatred. It's, we don't like you, not because of anything that you are. We don't even know you personally, but you're a Jew, and that's bad enough. That's incriminating enough. There was also, in terms of changing demographics, there's also the shrinking population of Nazarene believers. Now, how did this happen? Well, some of them just simply died in the Roman-Jewish wars. They were killed by the Romans. The entire city of Jerusalem, we remember, was attacked and destroyed. I mean, not totally razed to the ground, but the whole, no matter where you went in the city, there was going to be destruction. It doesn't mean that everything was destroyed, but it means there's destruction everywhere. And there was death everywhere. And many of the Nazarenes suffered at the hands of the Romans. And that's how some of them went. Some of them also, over the course of a few centuries, and we're kind of talking in a broad sense now, from the 1st century until the 4th century, some of them either kind of got absorbed or reabsorbed back into mainstream Judaism and left their belief in Yeshua, or following of Yeshua, really, or they became secret followers of Yeshua. And in terms of saying how many did that or who they were, there's really not any way of determining that. We also find that some of them, unfortunately, went into the Gentile world, into the Gentile churches, Gentile Christianity, and said, our brothers have rejected us, at least you still believe in Jesus, so we're going to join you guys and be Christians instead of being Nazarenes. And so they gave up Torah and they started mixing in with these Gentile populations. And eventually they lost their Jewishness. They became Gentiles over, hundreds of years. Also, some of the Nazarenes, and again, this is all some of them. Some of them died, some of them were reabsorbed or absorbed. Some of them were scattered throughout the Middle East, which is like Judea, Syria, Arabia, Parthia in the east, and possibly Pella, which is in Jordan, and then possibly also Babylon as well. And so I say possibly just because we're not exactly sure, but we have little hints over here, a suggestion over here, circumstantial evidence over here, and it seems like that was possibly the case. Also, some of the Nazarenes, they stayed faithful, but over time, these groups, over the centuries, they fractured into obscure or heretical sects. So basically, they just kept getting smaller and smaller groups, more and more smaller groups, and some of them just got into crazy stuff, unfortunately. Crazier than even Catholic Christianity. Believing in giant angels, and they come down and they're giving people a new book, and this is actually Jesus come back, and I'm describing a sect called the Alkacites. Those guys were weirdos. But anyways, in terms of continuing with our changing demographics, there's also the consolidation of Jewish authority in the sages, because the Sadducees are destroyed, the Essenes are destroyed, the Herodians are destroyed, some of the Hellenists are destroyed, all in the First and Second Roman Jewish Wars, mostly just the First Roman Jewish War. And so the only Jews that are left are the Pharisees, the common people who follow the Pharisees, and the Nazarenes and their followers. But the Pharisees and their followers was a much larger group than the Nazarenes, because we have to remember the Pharisees had existed for hundreds of years. The Nazarenes had only been around for less than 100. And so it's a matter of time and a matter of growth. And also, a lot of people just felt, well, we have the Torah. God said that was the life and the length of our days. And isn't that good enough? And it's like, well, yes, it is. But if something's true, why not accept it? Right? At least that's my perspective. I will admit that. But we see the consolidation of Jewish authority in the sages, especially those from the line of King David. And why? Simply put, because King David was this glorious, almost legendary figure in the Jewish mind. Not legendary in the sense of it being false, but sense of it being ancient and glorious. And when the monarchy was destroyed and the temple was destroyed, people could look to these sages that were descended from King David and say, we're out and down on our luck, so to speak. Our temple's destroyed. Our people are destroyed, almost. We're scattered over the entire earth. But God has kept his promise to King David to perpetuate his line. God still loves us, and he has sent us descendants from the glorious King David to teach us his holy Torah. And so these sages almost became spiritual kings in a certain sense. Not political kings like David was, but spiritual quote-unquote kings. Again, this is a metaphor. In the sense of teaching the people and leading the people in spiritual matters. Now, they didn't have to be from the line of David. They could be from anyone. But this was kind of a symbolic thing. So, and I believe that Rabban Gamliel II was from this line of David. Also, Rabbinic Judaism, or Judaism as taught by the Tanaim, the Tanaitic rabbis, it emerges as a distinct form of Judaism and becomes the descendant of Phariseeism. So around the 2nd century, we really see this Phariseeism kind of being a thing in the past and Rabbinic Judaism being the current thing. Now, their beliefs are the same, their practices are the same, their teachings are the same, but it's more advanced, and there's enough different things about it, such as the destruction of the temple, that separate the two things, where there are unique things for both of them. There's also the Roman renaming of the land of Israel, Eretz Yisrael. They rename it Syria Palestina, or Syrian Palestine. And so you want to know where, the name Palestine comes for Judea. It comes from the Romans. It's the Romans' fault. So moving on, in terms of the early church fathers' condemnation of the Jews, as if the Jews, all of them, 100% of them, did anything, we find that some of these early church fathers started blaming all Jews for the death of Jesus. And this led some of them, after contact with the Jews and just studying the Bible and things that they had been taught, and then they started forming their own ideas, this started bringing forth some very nasty beliefs and very nasty comments. So, for example, we're going to be briefly talking about Marcion. And Marcion was this guy in the early 2nd century who rejected the entire Tanakh, the Old Testament. He said all of it is horrible. That was for the old God, but the new God, Jesus, gave us a new Bible. So he only used edited forms, or an edited version of the Gospel of Luke, and then Paul's epistles. But he had edited all the Jewish stuff out of it, and he'd put his own ideas into it. And so really they weren't even Luke and Paul's writings, it was his own. But basically he used them as a template. And then we're going to be talking about Marcion later, so I'm not going to touch on him too much right now. But then in terms of some other figures, we're going to be looking at two in particular. We're going to be looking at Ignatius with his epistle to the Magnesians, and we're going to be looking at the epistle of Barnabas, which was not actually written by the Barnabas, the friend of Paul. It was written by a Barnabas in the 2nd century, not the 1st. And so Ignatius, who is one of these early church fathers, he says, in Magnesians 8, verse 1, he says, "Be not seduced by strange doctrines, nor by antiquated fables, which are profitless. For even if unto this day we live after the manner of Judaism, we avow that we have not received grace." And later on in chapter 10, he says, "Seeing that we have become his disciples, let us learn to live as beseemeth Christianity. For whoso is called by another name besides this is not of God. Therefore put away the vile leaven which has waxed stale and sour, and betake yourselves to the new leaven, which is Jesus Christ. It is monstrous to talk of Jesus Christ and to practice Judaism. For Christianity did not believe in Judaism, but Judaism in Christianity, wherein every tongue believed and was gathered together unto God." That's actually an actual recording. Did you know that? No, but as we see, we find that people like Ignatius, and Ignatius was not alone, this is just an example, but he thought that Judaism and belief in Yeshua, or following Yeshua, were two totally incompatible things. And this is what modern Christianity thinks to begin with, right? This is what they have thought for centuries. But these beliefs and these ideas are not modern. They come down to these early church fathers and the people and the writings of the 2nd century AD. We also have the Epistle of Barnabas, which I'm not going to read all the citations because they're on your screen. I'm just going to read them and see if, and you can see if they're very friendly toward Jews. Okay, so here's the first one. He wanteth neither sacrifices nor whole burnt offerings. These things therefore he annulled, that the new law of Jesus Christ, being free from the yoke of constraint. Didn't Yeshua say in Matthew 5, I have not come to annul the law? The people whom he had prepared in his well-beloved would believe in simplicity, manifested to us beforehand concerning all things, that we might not as novices shipwreck ourselves upon the law, right, upon the Torah. They, the Jews, lost the covenant with God in this way forever when Moses had just received it. So basically what he's saying is that when the Jews when Israel had made the golden calf, God had made a covenant with them, they made the golden calf, and they blew it at that time. And for the past 1400 years, at that point, they had not been the people of God. So basically, the Epistle of Barnabas is saying Israel had never been the children of God. That's not biblical whatsoever. But there are people even today that think that. When ye see that after so many signs and wonders were wrought in Israel, even then they were abandoned by God. The circumcision in which they have confidence is abolished. For he hath said that a circumcision not of the flesh should be practiced, but they transgressed, for an evil angel taught them. So now he's saying that the Torah was given by an evil angel. He's not saying that God gave the Torah, which we know for a fact because the Bible says so. But he's saying that, circumcision's abolished and they keep doing it because an evil angel taught them to do it. They're being seduced by evil angels. Additionally, in Barnabas chapter 12, it denies that, this is something that I just thought was very strange. It denies that Yeshua is the physical descendant of David. And I can't for the life of me think of why the author would say this. He said that he is not the son of David, only the son of God. And in context, this is referring to some kind of heavenly origins or Jesus being a spiritual being and not physically descended from David. I mean, that's what Luke and Matthew start their Gospels with, is the birth of Yeshua and his genealogies. Right? There's no point to genealogy if you don't have one. But apparently the writer of the Epistle of Barnabas thought that there was no need to have a genealogy. Also, between chapters 9 through 19, the Epistle of Barnabas reinterprets various commandments, such as the Sabbath and kosher dietary laws, and teaches that the literal commandments are abolished, and that Israel had never interpreted the Torah correctly because they were never the sons of God. And so when the Bible says, don't eat pork, it really means don't do certain sexual practices. Or when it says to rest on the Sabbath, it really means to find rest in Jesus, even though he wouldn't come for another 1400 years. Right? Which means that that commandment would be impossible to keep for centuries and centuries and centuries and centuries. So we find that the writer of the Epistle of Barnabas is twisting and perverting the entire Bible. He's basically saying the Jews were never the people of God. They've never been right about anything. God has never had a relationship with them. They're just a bunch of, and I mean this in a theological sense, a bunch of damned people. They've never been anything good. Even though Paul himself says in Romans 3 that the oracles or the divine revelations of God had been given exclusively to the Jews, and that was a benefit of being Jewish and being circumcised. So we see that he's not even going in line with Paul, he's just making things up. But even though these beliefs were not totally believed they were half believed by a lot of people. In fact, some people wanted the Epistle of Barnabas in the New Testament. And thank God it wasn't, because else we'd have a very, very different and hateful form of Christianity than what turned out to be. So, putting that behind us, for our last slide, or our last topic as part of this, Roman policies toward the Christians. In the 60s CE, in the 1st century, the Emperor Nero persecutes Gentile Christians, and he can get away with this because, if we remember, Christianity at this time was not a legalized religion. It was not covered under the religio licita policy, or the licit religion policy, as it would be a literal translation into English. Judaism was covered, though. It was protected under Roman law. Christianity was not, because it was a new religion, and this policy only covered ancient religions, and Christianity was not ancient. In the 90s, a few decades later, this is after the destruction of the temple, and by this time, the Jesus movement had already become very Gentilized, or Hellenized. And so the Emperor Nerva, he exempts Christians from paying a certain tax that only Jews had to pay. It was called the Fiscus Judaicus, or the Jewish tax, is literally what it is, which was established in the 70s after the destruction of the temple as punishment against the Jews for the Roman-Jewish War. Because, this is what's interesting, because Nerva did not consider Christians to be Jews. So we find that now, even from a Roman perspective, there's big differences, even by the end of the 1st century. In the 100s, or in the 2nd century, there are Jewish-specific Roman policies that came to no longer affect Gentile Christians. So basically, if Rome passed a law for Jews, in the 1st century, that would have covered many Christians. In the 2nd century, Christians were not included in those Jewish laws. What I mean by that is, for example, if the Roman Empire passed a tax only on Jews, Gentiles would be excluded from that. However, there is one interesting thing that I thought I would also include, and it's that a new Roman law comes into effect during the 2nd century, which banned Gentiles from circumcising their children. And it punished them as if these Gentiles were castrating their children. And unfortunately, this is something that has been thrown around today even by despicable people. And this is something that prohibited Gentiles from circumcising. And presumably, even if you converted to Judaism, you would not be allowed to circumcise your sons as God commands. And so what this did for a lot of Christians, they said, well, we don't technically have to circumcise our sons because the Noahide laws don't tell us that we have to. The apostles didn't teach that we had to be saved. Even though it's still a good thing, let's just not do it. And so this discouraged a lot of Gentiles from further pursuing the commandments because Roman law banned them from doing it. And at that time, it was much easier to be caught as a circumcised or uncircumcised person, because when you would go to the bathhouse, of course you're not going to bathe with all your robes on. People are going to see you. And, it's like you get a new tattoo on your face. People are going to see you. It's going to be very obvious. And so that was a big dampener on motivation for Gentiles to continue pursuing commandments. And it really helped just drive a deeper wedge to deepen the fissure between these two faiths and help them crack apart into two different things. For a conclusion, we find that both sides had to cope with the destruction of the temple, and they both responded in different ways. The Pharisees spiritualized a lot of these practices from the temple, and so then when the temple was destroyed, they thought, well, okay, this is obviously a big setback, but it's not the end of us. We're not done for. We're not ruined. We're not out of business like the Sadducees and like the Essenes. We can still go on in some way. The Nazarenes, some of them, either kind of basically, there's two directions they went. One followed the Pharisees. One said all this stuff never should have been happening in the first place, or God has done away with sacrifices. And so some were pro-temple, some believed that the temple was done away with. And this was not necessarily the immediate reaction, but it is something that the Nazarenes believed in the centuries preceding the time of the apostles. When they started believing this, we really don't know, because Nazarene documents were either destroyed or lost to history, or they weren't even written down. And so when we're trying to figure out when they started believing things or when they started doing things, it can be very tricky. This could have been hundreds of years after the apostles. It could have been a few decades after the apostles. We just simply don't know. I prefer the later date, but that's just because of my own personal theology. And my view of history. It's not really supportable. Does that make sense? Additionally, we find that there is a division between the two that was largely based on politics. It was a very political decision on, unfortunately, the Jewish side and theological on the Gentile side. So basically, mainstream Jews said to Nazarene Jews, you didn't support Bar Kokhba, you don't support us in other political ways, we're not going to excommunicate you, you're just not welcome around here. Now, toward Gentile believers, obviously there's going to be a lot of theological differences, such as they still believe in the continuation of the temple and the services and the keeping of the Torah, and the Gentile Noahide Jesus believers didn't generally accept these, although in a few weeks we will be covering some who did, who actually celebrated the festivals with Jews, who kept many of the commandments regardless of what Roman law had to say. And it's actually a really interesting thing. I'm really looking forward to getting into that. So there's the lack of Nazarene support for Bar Kokhba, or Bar Kosiba as he was actually called, increasingly anti-Semitic Gentile theology, and anti-religiously Jewish theology. And there's also the Roman legal treatment toward Christians and Jews. Lastly, I would like to read something from this book that I have. It's actually a really interesting book. I've not even read all of it quite yet, but there's a very interesting passage that I would like to read. And it's on 10 to 11, these are the pages, of a book called The Halakha of Jesus of Nazareth According to the Gospel of Matthew by Philip Siegel. And he says, thus it was not the supposed antinomian, or lawless, or anti-halakhic posture of Christianity, or the Christology. It was incompatible with Pharisaic Judaism that led to the separation of faiths. So it wasn't because of legal or theological reasons that the Nazarenes and the Pharisees split, or Nazarenes and mainstream Judaism split. The premise that underlies this work is that, this work meaning this book, is that at no time during the first 5 decades after the crucifixion were Christian Judaism and pre-rabbinic Judaism wholly incompatible. Like, there's no differences. Post-70, after the destruction of the temple, post-70 Jews were antagonistic to the returned Christians at Jerusalem, the Nazarenes. The Nazarenes had fled to Pella, and then they came back to Jerusalem. Antagonists to the Nazarenes at Jerusalem and to the expansion and success of their movement. This success implied a growing anti-national trend among Palestinian Jews, and thus a shrinking reservoir of population available for a future war of messianic liberation. It was undoubtedly with broad-based support of the nationalist elements that Gamaliel II and his circle were able to supersede Yochanan ben Zakkai and his peace circle at Yavna. The suppression, isolation, and separation of Christianity followed. Now, when it's talking about Christianity, it's referring to the Jesus movement. What concerns us, however, is that just as at the end of the century it was neither theology nor halakha that finalized the schism between Rabbinic Judaism and Christian Judaism, so at the year 30, neither theology nor halakha brought about the crucifixion. And because neither theology nor halakha were at stake, the proto-rabbis, the Tanaim, the Tanaitic rabbis, who were leading the non-establishment spiritual leaders, were not in controversy with Yeshua. They were not, quote, the Pharisees of the New Testament. They were brothers under the skin to Jesus. What made their successors, the rabbis at Yavna, antagonists to Jesus' successors was not theology, nor halacha, but national and political complications, including accommodation with militant circles. That was with mainstream Judaism. The Nazarenes did not accommodate these militant elements. This view of the separation of Christian Judaism is therefore profoundly related to the thesis of this work in retrospect, and this thesis reinforces the view. For the halakha of Jesus of Nazareth, according to the Gospel of Matthew, places Jesus in line with proto-rabbinic teachers. He is sometimes stricter, because as we will see, he insists upon norms of piety that go beyond the minimum halakha, just as sometimes the school of Hillel did, and sometimes the school of Shammai did. His approach to the halakha is manifestly similar to that of the proto-rabbinic and rabbinic Judaism. And actually I'll continue, this is good. The fourth presupposition that contributes to obscuring a correct understanding of the halakha of Jesus of Nazareth is the tendency on the part of many scholars to seek to understand Jesus of Nazareth in the light of incarnation theology. And he goes on to say that because people want to believe that Jesus is God, that it's impossible to really look at Jesus as a rabbi and a teacher. And when people take this view, because a lot of times you'll hear people say, oh, well, he was God, he can do whatever he wants, he can change the Torah if he wants to, even though God previously said that he never would. The author is saying by seeing Jesus in a human view, I guess you could say, seeing him as a human Jewish rabbi, that we can understand his views better, and then subsequently, if we can understand his views better, then we can understand the Nazarenes better. And when we understand the Nazarenes better, we'll realize that it was not theological differences that split mainstream Judaism and Nazarene Judaism apart from one another. It was mostly political. Now, some of it, yes, was theological, and over time it became more theological because some of the Jewish believers started believing in weird things. But in the early days, in the 1st and 2nd centuries, these were kosher Orthodox Jews. And so with that, I hope that this has been interesting and maybe even entertaining. And I hope that this, while it's not a very deep lesson, I don't think I would say, it does give us kind of a primer, kind of a basic introduction to the concept of the parting of the ways, which again is an academic term referring to the split of Judaism and Christianity. And so with that, I bid you adieu, and as always, be a chassid.